The wind had a way of whispering through the pines that skirted the edge of my cabin, carrying with it a chill that wasn't entirely from the October air. I had always loved this place for its isolation, the way the small lake mirrored the sky like glass, the way the wood smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and how the world seemed to pause just beyond the tree line. For me, this cabin was more than a getaway, it was a sanctuary, a testament to years of work and quiet persistence. I'd arrived that Friday evening with the sun sinking behind the mountains, painting the horizon in bruised purples and golds. The driveway was soft with fallen leaves, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and cedar. I set my duffel bag by the door, flicked on the porch light, and breathed in the solitude, letting the peace settle into my chest like a warm quilt. That's when I heard the knock. It wasn't gentle. Not the polite, neighborly tap of someone borrowing sugar or returning a forgotten tool. This knock was sharp, insistent, demanding attention. I opened the door to find Karen Whitman, the HOA president, standing there with her oversized sunglasses and perfectly coiffed hair, even in the fading light. She looked like she had just stepped off a magazine cover, but the sharp set of her jaw and the way she tapped her designer heel on my porch screamed trouble. "Hello, Jenna," she said, her voice smooth but edged with something I couldn't quite name. "We need to talk about the cabin." I frowned, unsure if I should step aside or slam the door in her face. "About the cabin?" I echoed. "I live here." "What exactly?" "About this weekend," she interrupted, cutting me off before I could finish. "I've decided I want it. My family is coming, and you'll be vacating." The words hung in the air, absurd and heavy. I blinked at her, certain that some part of me was mishearing. "Excuse me?" Karen adjusted her sunglasses, the gesture calculated and precise. "I said, you'll be vacating. I reserved this cabin through the HOA's weekend rotation. It's only fair. You've had it long enough." I stared at her, the anger rising slowly like a tide. I had purchased this cabin with my own money, through years of saving and sacrifices, only to have it commandeered by someone who thought authority came from a title and a set of bylaws she barely understood. "Karen." "I'm sorry, but this is my property," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. "You don't reserve someone else's home." That's irrelevant," she snapped. "The HOA rules are clear. If you refuse, I'll have to involve the authorities." Her words were precise, practiced, rehearsed, but they didn't scare me. They made my hands shake with anger, my stomach twist with disbelief. She was weaponizing bureaucracy as if it were a gun. I wanted to laugh and scream at the same time. "You're calling the cops over this?" I asked, my voice rising. "Because I said no?" Karen smiled, but it was brittle, a mask that barely concealed irritation. "You have to understand, Jenna, I'm only enforcing the rules. You could make this easy, or you could make it very uncomfortable for yourself." I let the silence linger, the forest around us humming softly with the early night sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, the distant splash of water. My chest heaved, but I refused to step back. "Karen, this isn't a vacation property the HOA owns. This is my home. You don't get to decide weekends here." Her eyes narrowed. "I can, and I will, if necessary. Consider this your warning." With that, she turned on her heel and strode back to her car parked across the street, clicking her heels with finality. I stood there for a moment, staring at the space where she had been, trying to comprehend how quickly my sanctuary had turned into a battleground. The wind picked up, rustling the pines like an ominous chorus, and I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By the time darkness had fully claimed the sky, Karen had already made her move. Around 10 that night, a squad car rolled slowly down the gravel road, headlights cutting through the trees. The officer's knock on my door was firm but cautious, a polite echo of Karen's aggression earlier. I opened it to find Officer Luis Ramirez, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a weary patience. "Evening, ma'am. We received a complaint from the HOA president regarding your cabin. She says there's a dispute over weekend occupancy." I felt my jaw tighten. "Yes, officer. There is. But let me be clear, this is my property. I'm not breaking any laws by staying here. He nodded, almost apologetically.
Understood. I'm just here to report and ensure no laws are being broken. No one's making any arrests tonight.
I closed the door, leaning back against it with a heavy sigh.
The adrenaline was fading, leaving a pulse of exhaustion behind.
But in its place, a resolve began to take root. Karen had shown her hand, but she wouldn't intimidate me out of my home.
Not this time.
As I walked to the window and looked out at the darkened lake, I realized that this weekend was no longer just a weekend. It was a test, a measure of how far I would stand for what was mine, for my rights, for my sanctuary. The air smelled of rain now, a faint metallic tang that promised storms.
And maybe, I thought with a grim smile, a storm was exactly what I needed.
Saturday morning arrived like a slow drumbeat, the sky bruised gray with low clouds hanging over the cabin. The wind carried the scent of damp leaves and pine, a subtle warning that the weekend would not unfold quietly. I had brewed a strong pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the small kitchen, trying to steady my nerves. Each sip burned warmth into my chest, though it did little to calm the flutter of anxiety in my stomach.
Karen Whitman's shadow loomed large in my thoughts.
I knew she was out there somewhere, organizing her forces, planning her move with the precision of a general. The HOA was her army, and I was, for all intents and purposes, a lone civilian defending her home front. I imagined her pacing her living room, clipboard in hand, rehearsing each demand with a mechanical smile, completely blind to the humanity she was attempting to bulldoze. The first sign of her advance arrived mid-morning. A neighbor's dog barked insistently, and I stepped onto the porch to see Karen's shiny black SUV idling near the edge of my driveway. Two other women emerged, likely her allies in this HOA crusade, arms crossed, eyes sharp, smiles tight. They looked like predators, or worse, like they were on some mission to test the limits of civility. Karen's gaze met mine, and for a moment the world felt suspended. There was no greeting, no small talk, just a cold, crystallized certainty in her stance that she was entitled, that the cabin belonged, in some abstract sense, to her weekend plans.
"I see you're awake," she said, her voice sweet, but underlined with a threat I could almost feel vibrating in the air. "I expected you to have left by now."
I set my mug down with deliberate care, letting it thump against the counter in a sound that seemed louder than it should.
"Karen," I said slowly, "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home.
You can't just decide it's yours for the weekend." She tilted her head, like she was considering whether I was joking. Jenna, there's no need to be dramatic.
It's just a weekend. You could make this easier, for everyone. And if I don't?"
I asked, forcing myself to keep my voice calm even as heat rose in my chest.
Karen's smile tightened. "Then,
I'm afraid it becomes a matter for the authorities." The subtle click of her heels on the gravel made my pulse jump. Her threat wasn't idle, I could see it in the way her eyes scanned the cabin, sizing up every window, every door, as if the entire structure could be claimed by willpower alone. My sanctuary, my peace, had become a stage for confrontation, and Karen was the star demanding control.
Hours passed in a tense stalemate.
I stayed inside, pacing between the kitchen, the living room, and the window that faced the lake. Every rustle of the trees, every distant bird call seemed to carry the weight of imminent conflict. I thought about calling the police preemptively, but each time I considered it, I hesitated. Luis Ramirez had been kind, professional, but I knew law enforcement wouldn't force her to leave, they could only respond if a law was broken. And Karen was clever enough to cloak her intimidation in the thin guise of rules and regulations.
By late afternoon, the situation escalated.
Karen's SUV had multiplied into a small convoy, hers and two others, each vehicle gleaming in the muted light, like soldiers forming a line of siege. She approached the cabin again, this time knocking with a force that reverberated through the doorframe. I opened it slowly, holding the door in one hand and clenching my fist behind my back.
"Karen," I said evenly, "this is your final warning. You will not take my home. Leave now."
Her lips curled into a faint, patronizing smile.
"I'm afraid you don't understand, Jenna. There are consequences for defiance.
The HOA has rules, and we enforce them.
You're making this difficult."
I shook my head, the tension coiling in my shoulders.
"I'm making this necessary. I won't let you bully me out of my own home.
She leaned in, close enough that I could smell her perfume, lavender and something sharp.
You're stubborn.
I like that in some people, but not in situations like this.
You could make this simple.
Or, make it very unpleasant for yourself. It was a threat, wrapped in civility. But I could feel the storm of emotions inside me, fear, indignation, fury, swelling into a force I couldn't ignore. Karen was trying to strip away my sense of control, my right to say no, my sanctuary.
And I realized something essential: I would not surrender. The first siren arrived at that moment.
I hadn't expected it to be so immediate, but Karen had clearly called ahead. Luis Ramirez appeared again, this time with another officer, both walking carefully onto my porch. Their faces were calm, professional, but there was tension in their posture, an unspoken acknowledgement that the HOA battle had escalated into a public affair.
Evening, Jenna, Luis said, nodding. We're here to mediate and make sure everyone stays safe.
I'm staying in my home, I said firmly.
Nothing illegal is happening here. I'm not leaving.
Karen stepped back, giving a sharp, frustrated glance at the officers.
See?
Stubborn, uncooperative, she's making this unnecessarily complicated.
Luis raised a hand, the universal gesture of calm authority.
Ma'am, we understand your concerns, but right now, there's no legal basis for removal.
If she's not breaking any laws, there's nothing we can do. We're here to prevent escalation, not enforce HOA rules.
Her face twitched, a subtle crack in her composed mask. I could see the first flickers of frustration and disbelief. She had assumed power, assumed entitlement, and now the very law enforcement she invoked was denying her authority.
Hours blurred into evening. Karen retreated temporarily, but the damage was done.
The confrontation had cemented itself in the air, thick and heavy.
I couldn't relax, couldn't settle back into the comfort of my cabin.
The storm that had been promised in the wind outside was mirrored inside me, a whirlwind of fear, anger, and determination. By nightfall, the showdown had transformed into a psychological siege. Karen had called neighbors, whispered about rule enforcement, and made veiled threats that echoed through the thin walls of my cabin.
But each attempt at intimidation only strengthened my resolve.
Every knock at the door, every glance through the window, reminded me that standing firm wasn't just about protecting property, it was about preserving dignity, autonomy, and the principle that no one could bully me out of what was mine. I poured another cup of coffee and watched the dark lake, its surface reflecting the trembling moonlight. Karen's battle lines were drawn outside my walls, but inside, I felt a fierce, unshakable calm. I had chosen the ground I would defend, and I knew that this weekend would not end with compromise. It would end with justice, or at least with the acknowledgement that I would not yield. As the wind howled through the pines, a promise seemed to echo through the cabin, whispered and certain: I would not be broken. And if Karen thought she could force her way through fear and rules, she had another thing coming. The weekend had become more than a weekend. It was a crucible of integrity and courage, a test of character against entitlement.
And I intended to win.
Sunday morning arrived with a brittle clarity, the kind of light that makes shadows sharper and decisions heavier. The wind had settled overnight, leaving the pines still but alert, like witnesses waiting for a verdict.
I woke early, still tense from the previous day's confrontations, the memory of Karen Whitman's piercing gaze and clipped threats replaying in my mind.
The cabin felt different now, charged with the lingering energy of conflict. My sanctuary had become a battleground, and every familiar corner, the warm kitchen, the worn couch, the view of the lake, seemed to pulse with the anticipation of what was coming. I sipped coffee slowly, savoring the quiet, though I knew it was a fragile calm.
Karen would not retreat without one final effort. By mid-morning, the inevitable arrived.
I was in the living room, watching sunlight streak across the wooden floorboards, when I heard the telltale crunch of gravel under tires.
Peering through the curtains, I saw Karen's black SUV pulling up again, this time accompanied by two other vehicles.
She emerged with her usual precision, sunglasses perched on her nose, clipboard in hand, radiating authority. But there was a subtle change. I noticed the tightness in her jaw, the small flicker of hesitation in her eyes. She was determined, yes, but the events of the previous day had shaken the certainty she carried like armor. Still, she approached with confidence, heels clicking like a metronome counting down a confrontation I had long prepared for. "Jenna," she called, her voice carrying across the yard, "I'm here to give you one last chance. You can vacate now, and this weekend will be far less complicated for you." I stepped onto the porch, holding my head high, refusing to let her intimidation penetrate my resolve.
"Karen, I've been clear. This is my home. You have no right to claim it. You cannot force me out."
She smiled, thin and practiced, but the tension beneath it was palpable.
"Rules are rules, Jenna.
The HOA has authority, and I'm merely enforcing it." I shook my head, firm.
Authority doesn't give you the right to bully.
I've already involved the police, and they've made it clear there's no legal basis for you to remove me.
If you come onto my property, that will be trespassing.
For a moment, her composure faltered. I saw it in the twitch of her mouth, the way she glanced at her companions. It was the first crack in her armor, the moment when entitlement collided with reality. "You don't understand," she said through clenched teeth, lowering her sunglasses to glare directly at me.
"This isn't just about rules. It's about respect." "Respect isn't taken by force," I replied. "It's earned. And you've shown none."
The silence that followed was thick, almost tactile. Even the officers, Luis Ramirez and his partner, were watching from a distance, alert but not intervening, letting the confrontation play out with a delicate balance of law and restraint. Karen's face tightened, frustration spilling over into impatience. She took a step closer, her clipboard raised like a shield.
"You leave me no choice. I will call the authorities again. This time, they might not be so understanding." I stood my ground. "Go ahead.
Explain to them why you want to take someone else's home for a weekend."
"I'll wait. I've done nothing wrong."
She hesitated, perhaps realizing the absurdity of her insistence when framed against the legal reality and the sheer determination radiating from me. But her pride, carefully constructed over years of asserting dominance in the HOA, would not allow her to back down entirely. She inhaled sharply, muttered something under her breath, and finally signaled her companions to step back. Then, the final move came, not from her, but from me. I opened the door wider and stepped forward, projecting calm confidence.
"Karen, this cabin is not negotiable. My home is not a commodity to be rotated for convenience.
You can leave now, or the police will document your trespassing. The choice is yours." Her eyes darted to the officers again, searching for validation, for someone to tip the scales in her favor.
But there was none.
Luis Ramirez shook his head slightly, a silent signal that the law was on my side. Karen's shoulders slumped imperceptibly, and the tight set of her lips softened, just a fraction. After a long pause, she folded her arms, looked out at the lake shimmering in the late morning sun, and finally spoke with a begrudging resignation.
"Fine. Have it your way. This weekend is yours."
I exhaled slowly, relief and lingering tension mingling in my chest. The storm had passed, not with violence or compromise, but with the affirmation of right and reason. I watched as Karen and her companions retreated to their SUVs, her posture stiff but defeated, the image of entitlement finally meeting the limits of reality. The lake reflected the sunlight now, fractured into shards of silver as the wind picked up slightly, carrying away the remnants of conflict. I closed the door, leaning against it for a moment, letting the adrenaline ebb. The cabin was mine, unchallenged, unyielding. But the victory was more than just physical, it was moral, emotional, a testament to standing firm for one's home and one's dignity. As I moved through the cabin, checking locks, windows, and the small comforts I had curated over years, I felt a profound sense of reclamation. The pines whispered outside, and I imagined they carried the story of this confrontation, a subtle acknowledgement of perseverance and courage. The wind through the leaves no longer felt like a warning, it felt like a chorus, celebrating the resilience of quiet strength. By afternoon, the sun had broken through the clouds entirely, warming the cabin with a soft, golden light. I stepped outside to the deck, gazing at the lake as the water sparkled like scattered diamonds.
For a moment, everything seemed suspended, perfect in its stillness.
Karen's intrusion, the fear, the confrontation, all of it had passed. And in its place was something deeper, A sense of empowerment, of self-respect, of understanding that home is not just a physical space but a claim to one's own voice and integrity. I poured a glass of iced tea, carrying it out to the railing, and let the warmth of the afternoon sun seep into my bones. The solitude was no longer just peaceful, it was victorious. The cabin had endured, and so had I. In that quiet triumph, I realized that some battles are worth fighting, not for anger or revenge, but for the affirmation of who we are and the life we choose to protect. Karen had tested me, had tried to bend my resolve with threats and rules, but she had underestimated the quiet strength of someone defending their home. And as the sun set behind the mountains, casting long, soft shadows over the lake and the pines, I knew that my sanctuary was mine again. The storm had come, the showdown had passed, and in its wake, there was a peace born of standing firm, a peace that no entitlement, no authority, and no threat could ever take away. The weekend stretched ahead, unclaimed by those who thought it could be theirs by decree. It was mine, in every sense that mattered: freedom, safety, and the profound affirmation that sometimes, standing your ground is the truest way to find peace. The cabin, the lake, the pines, they whispered their quiet approval. And I, finally, allowed myself to breathe fully, knowing that this victory was both small and monumental, ordinary and extraordinary, and entirely worth every moment of the battle.